Hello and welcome to this, the first video on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Everything you see in this video series comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. You can see the cover here on the screen. It's the complete novel alongside my detailed analysis. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the author Jane Austen. Well, when studying an author, it's important only to consider the aspects of their life which are reflected in the text you're studying. The problem is, you see, you can get carried away in the biographical detail and just read books and books and books and hundreds of pages of web pages and journals about the writer. But really, when it comes to studying just one text, like Pride and Prejudice, you just want to know, what is it that happened in Austen's life that seems to be important to help our understanding of Pride and Prejudice? So we don't actually know a great deal about Jane Austen. And the reason I say we don't actually know it is because there's a lot of speculation. But what we actually officially know about her comes mostly from letters that she wrote herself. But those letters, you see, were either deliberately destroyed or censored, so bits were taken out of them and, crossed over by Austen's relatives after her death. So the things we do know are perhaps not the most interesting personal details because those have been censored. But I think there are 3 or 4 things about her life that are important to help us in our understanding of the novel. The first one revolves around her father, George. He was a clergyman and he had 8 children, and his income was around £600 a year. Now, there's a lot in the novel about money, so I've done some quite detailed research into the money because it's so hard as a modern reader reading the text to kind of understand, well, what exactly does it mean when they talk about £2,000 a year and that sort of thing. So let me put it into context for you. When the novel was written, a farm worker, so a sort of general farm worker, would earn about £15 or £20 a year. So Austen's father on 600 was not a bad income at all, but it wasn't enough to live a life of high luxury. Now, in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins is so rude that he mentions the income which would be available to the Bennet family after Mr. Bennet's death. Mr. Bennet has an income of £2,000 a year, along with his house, which would go to Mr. Collins, and Mrs. Bennet would have to live off £1,000 in the 4%. Now, what does that mean? Well, with Mr. Bennet's income entailed to Mr. Collins, all that would be left is the interest on Mrs. Bennet's £5,000 marriage settlement, which would be about £200 a year. This is a little bit confusing, but just think about this as a statistic. Of that, Elizabeth could expect an equal daughterly share of 1/5, which would leave her with about £40 a year if she wasn't to marry before her father's death. Because obviously if she marries, she will, have the money that, or she'll be provided for from her husband's money. So if she doesn't marry, she can expect £40 a year. And that helps the reader to understand the necessity of marriage for the Bennet girls, and also to respect more the strength of Elizabeth's convictions in refusing both Mr. Collins and, first time round, Mr. Darcy. If the girls fail to marry before their father's death, they'll have an allowance not much different to that of a farm labourer. Now, if we then bring that back to Jane Austen herself, although Austen's father wasn't exactly poor, he certainly wasn't rich enough to offer prospective husbands much financial opportunity in terms of a dowry, in terms of, you marry my daughter, I'll give you a lump sum. So Jane Austen is in quite a similar situation to the Bennet sisters, in that she would have felt a great social pressure to marry in order that she could carry on living the comfortable lifestyle she lived under her father's care. And when her father actually died in 1805, the family had to live off £450 a year, and Jane was supported largely by her brothers until her own death, because of course she never married. So you can see the pressure on a woman to marry at this time was huge, particularly in the middle and upper classes. There's always been a criticism of Jane Austen that although her writing is fantastic, and Pride and Prejudice is certainly in my top 5 novels of all time personally, She writes in a very realistic style, but it's often been criticised that it's only about the middle and upper classes, and she doesn't at all ever address the working class. And that's true. If you're in the working class, you could, in some ways, marry who you wanted because you wouldn't have any money, he wouldn't have any money, so, you know, two times nothing is nothing. The second interesting point about Jane Austen and her biographical details revolves around this man, Tom Leffroy. Now, I love the Google because I've researched all these things, but you can also pull up their pictures. Isn't that fantastic? You can see here, this looks like a sort of miniature portrait. There are different accounts of this story. The exact details are sort of unclear, but basically it's understood that Austen did fall in love with this Irishman, Tom Leffroy. In one of her letters from 1796, she wrote, "At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Leffroy, and when you receive this it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea." And that's the end of the quote. So it seems that Leffroy and Austen were basically falling in love and about to get engaged, but Leffroy's father was unhappy about the idea of his daughter marrying into a family with such low connections and wealth that his parents actually sent him back to Ireland. So the idea that social class could prevent a loving marriage is something that is obviously explored in Pride and Prejudice, and I'll cover that a little bit more in future videos. So you can see that some of the events of her life are reflected in Austen's novel. This guy with the big nose, this is another potential love interest. Very interesting point actually, because if a man rejected her because of her social class, we certainly can't say the same about Jane Austen herself. In 1802, a wealthy gentleman called Harris Bigwither proposed to Jane Austen, and Jane at first accepted the proposal but then changed her mind the next day. Although rich, Bigwither was, according to one of Austen's letters, big and awkward. Now, bearing in mind the financial situation Jane Austen was in, she was very brave to reject the proposal, and it certainly went against the custom of the day and is reflected in Elizabeth's rejections of Collins and at first Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. From the Leffroy and Bigwither incidents, it's plain to see that Austen believed in marrying for love, not wealth or status, and it's highly likely, of course, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to work out that the character of Elizabeth Bennet is probably based upon the author herself. So what happened to Austen in the end? Well, she died in 1817 at the age of just 41 and sadly never married. So she obviously stuck to what she believed in terms of love and marriage, but ended up dying single.